Hi, everybody. Welcome. I'm going to let everyone come into the session. But we're going to get started pretty much on time because we have a full session, lots of content to share with you today. And just for technical check, Jamie, can you see me okay?
I can.
Okay, and you can hear me okay?
I can.
Awesome. I have lost my screen, so I can't see myself, which is kind of nice. But so just keep me in check. All right, welcome everybody. This is our SACAC session on Can I Really Write About That? My name is Lindsey Ringenbach, and joining me today is my colleague, Jamie Pack. We are both college counselors with Advantage College Planning, and we're so excited about this session topic. We submitted this proposal 2 years ago for the in-person conference and resubmitted again for the virtual conference because this is a topic that we're really passionate about. We work with students and their essays all the time, as do you. And we really are concerned about helping students find their authentic voice. So professionally, this is something that we care deeply about and think a lot about. And then just personally, this is something that I think about too, as my own kids have gone through the college application process. Both of my students have written about some pretty controversial, I would say, topics. My oldest child is transgender, and he transitioned about his senior year in high school. And as he was going through that transition, he wanted to write and share his story in his application. And I 100% supported him. I wanted him to write about that because it really was him. That was his voice, his authenticity. But I was nervous because he was applying to a college that I considered somewhat conservative in rural North Carolina. So I was a little nervous about how his application essay would be received, but I supported him and it all worked out, which was great. Come along my next child, my youngest is a senior in high school, and he also wrote something fairly controversial, I would say. He experienced some significant trauma as a middle school student. His birth mom had a baby, and unfortunately the baby passed away at about a month old. So we all went through that devastating time. And he chose to write about that in his college application essay. And guiding him through that, I really struggled because I was so close to the story. So luckily, my colleague Jamie Pack was there to help me, and she provided some awesome feedback and really helped my son explain that and share his story. So that was really awesome. So I'm so excited to introduce Jamie Pack to you all. She's going to introduce herself and talk a little bit more about this topic. Welcome, Jamie.
Lindsey, I cannot see the slides.
Okay. Let's see. Can you see my screen still?
Nope, just you.
So just me. Okay. Let's see. I'm going to go back and screen share again.
All right, there we go. Now I see
your screen. We're good? Okay, awesome. I think we're working. Fantastic.
All right, so like Lindsey, I am also excited to talk with you all about essays today. Essays are without a doubt my favorite part of the entire admissions process and actually what brought me into this industry in the first place. My background is in writing and editing. So Lindsey's background is in the admissions process. She worked in admissions, she's worked in school counseling. My professional training is in writing and editing. My master's degree is in English. And when I was in graduate school a decade ago, I started working with college counselors and college essays on the side and have continued that work throughout. After grad school, I spent several years in higher ed, working in academic and student affairs, but continued seasonal work on college essays because I think editing is really fun. And then transitioned full-time into this work a few years ago. Like Lindsey said, we were originally approved to present on this topic at last year's in-person conference. And we think that it is hard to talk about essays without showing you actual essays, having you read essays. And we had hoped to be able to have a more collaborative session where we are workshopping on some essays. But we do have a Google Doc with case studies that we will share later in our presentation. But before we get started, I do want to open us up with some grounding thoughts. So first, we want you to be aware up front that we're going to be talking about some heavy subject matter today, including topics like child abuse and sexual assault. We have permission from some of our students to share their essays and their experiences with you, and we thank them for their vulnerability and their generosity. Second, you may not agree with everything we're going to say today, and that is okay. You may not like every essay you read today, and that is also okay. We know that there is no such thing as a perfect essay, and the essays we're looking at today are not perfect essays. One of them is not even a finished essay. And maybe you would not advise your student to submit all of them. We're going to be talking about some potentially controversial ideas, and so we may not always agree, and that's okay. But we do want to keep in mind that these are real essays written by real teenagers and that these essays are in the past. We are going to focus mainly on ideas and concepts today. We're not critiquing the essays themselves. These students have gone through the college admissions process and ultimately they have each been successful by their own definition. So with one last thank you to our students for sharing their stories with us, we are going to go ahead and get started with a question. We are curious to know if you have any no-never topics. Are there any no-never topics that you think students should never write about in the college essay? And you can define no-never however you want. We would like you to go ahead and share your no-nevers in the chat if you're comfortable while I go over our agenda for today. So Lindsey and I have already talked a little bit about who we are and why we're talking about this in the first place. Next, I'm going to go over some of our best practices for determining if a student is capable of tackling a difficult subject. I'm going to give you some questions that I ask my students or ask myself about my students to feel out if it's a good idea to head down a controversial path for the essay topic. Then Lindsey is going to take us through the case studies of our real students who did take a controversial topic or a tough topic and turn it into a personal statement. That's when I'll share the Google Doc of our case studies. Lastly, we will wrap up with our best tips and recommendations for walking a student through writing a difficult essay and the role that we tend to play as sounding board, editor, feedback giver, etc. All right, so I'm going to go over to the chat box and see what are some of your no-nevers. All right, we have someone who has said mission trips, someone who has said, I'm not sure there are hard rules about a no-never topic, but I do think there are no-never approaches. I like that. There are not no-never topics. It's all about how you handle the subject. Someone said the D's. We will talk about the D's in a little bit. Politics. All right, we have a couple of other answers and feel free to keep putting them in the chat, but we are gonna, that's all we've gotten so far, so we are gonna move on. Approach is everything, I like that. And thank you guys for sharing who have shared so far. Let's see if we end up covering any of your no-nevers. Again, you'll hear those D's again. And if we end up changing any minds today. So I'm gonna be honest, I don't think that there is such thing as a no-never for all students. I think that there are definitely overused topics, and I think a few of those came up in the chat. And I think that there are maybe no-nevers for individual students, usually because of where they are in their own personal growth and the amount of time that they have to write this essay. But I'm not sure that a no-never across the board exists. And I would have had a different answer when I first started working with college essays. I definitely thought there were a lot of no-nevers, and I would have started talking about words that start with a letter D. I would have talked about death, disease, divorce, depression, and maybe throw in dating and drugs, a whole list of D words. And I had a pretty fixed mindset about it because for the most part, most students do have other things that they can write about. But at the same time, there are also a lot of students who have had trying experiences that have really informed their lives and made them who they are, and they want to talk about them and they want to write about them. And I think we can all agree that we have seen an increase over recent years in teenagers being open about things like mental health and sexual identity and wanting to explore these in their teenage years and through the college process. Over the last year, especially during a global pandemic, there has been a magnifying glass on some of those Ds, on a virus and death and mental health and students' home lives. And I think it is safe to say that we're going to see an increase in students wanting to process these things in their college essays in the coming years. So let's talk about meeting students where they are and moving from a no-never mindset to a more open mindset when a student asks, can I really write about that? First, I think it's important that we walk the talk on authenticity. We tell students that when it comes to the essay, that their unique experience and their unique voice matters, and that being themselves matters. And then they bring this idea to the table and we're like, maybe don't be that authentic. And it's easy to shut down that line of conversation before it gets too far, because you know that conversation is going to take time and you have more than one student and it's the fall. And wouldn't it be easier if you just wrote about something else? But I do think it is worth hearing the student out and having that conversation, not only because you're learning more about the student and their perspective and building trust and relationships, but to get to the second point, an idea for an essay is not the same thing as an essay. That would be really nice if Intention wrote essays. And I'm sure you've seen this before, that as a student goes through the drafting process, that their original idea for a whole essay becomes a paragraph or a sentence or a supplement, or is nowhere in sight by the end of the process. So that conversation could lead to information that would be valuable in the application, even if it isn't the essay topic. And lastly, something that has moved me personally from a more fixed mindset to a more growth mindset has been seeing so many students navigate this process successfully. Students are capable of a lot. And I've worked with enough teenagers who can handle controversial topics well, and in some cases really well, to have confidence telling students, yeah, you kind of can really write about anything. And so when a student asks about a controversial subject, instead of saying, well, no, never, I say yes, if. So yes, you can really write about this if the essay at the end of the day is doing a little bit of magic. And let me tell you how excited I was when I realized I could spell magic with all of these words, because again, master's degree in English, love an acronym, love a play on words. So by magic, what we mean is it's showing maturity, authenticity, growth, insight, and character. We want those things from all essays, right? But especially an essay that when we're having a topic that maybe is a little bit tougher. So let's look at each of these a little bit closer. First, we have maturity. I think it's important to determine right out of the gate, is the student ready to tackle the subject? If my students are processing any sort of trauma, I want them to know right away and throughout the writing process that this is not the Tragedy Olympics. They don't owe their reader anything. They can share as much or as little as they want to about their personal experiences. And they are under no obligation to put themselves through something painful or unhealthy for a college application. We are not here to exploit a story for the admissions process at the expense of the student. But if a student decides, yes, I am ready to write about this, this is something I feel strongly about, here are my maturity-related follow-up questions. Does the subject matter and the way the student is handling it show college readiness? Is it passing the roommate test? Is the student taking any accountability if that's necessary in the story? If it's an issue that requires some high-level thinking, are they in the right headspace to do that? And are they capable of doing that high-level thinking? And then what about their use of language? Many of the topics we're going to discuss today have evoked some really strong emotions in our students, and that can come through in their writing, and those first drafts can be a real thunderstorm. So is the student able to keep their emotions in check while telling their story? And that's something they may not even realize is going to be difficult for them until they're halfway through the writing process. At the same time, we want to make sure that they don't swing too far in the other direction. So some students can get really robotic with their language and get really cut and dry and just give you facts without any emotion or personality. So can they keep their tone and language appropriate, but still retain their voice and sound like themselves throughout the process? Authenticity is next. So sometimes a student might be hearing from people in their lives that they should write about a certain topic. Whether or not they want to write about it, they're hearing that this is what you need to write about. And I think a great example of this is an essay that has stayed with me personally for several years. So I came into this essay process late in the game, and the student had a draft of an essay that was about a traumatic health experience she had had earlier in her high school years that started with a blood clot in her lungs. She spent several weeks in the hospital, missed a lot of school, had to stop all of her activities, had to relearn how to do a lot of basic life functions, upended her life sort of every way you would expect that it would. And she had this really triumphant recovery. She had to relearn her sport and actually had to relearn a new position because she was a rower and didn't have the lung capacity anymore. She caught up on all of her schoolwork. She was making top grades in top classes. She basically had this huge recovery triumphant story. And she was a strong writer, and the essay was good. And if she had been excited about it, she could have just done some polishing here and there, and she would have been fine. But I could tell that something was off. She was not excited about this essay. She was not seeming super proud of this essay. So I started asking her some questions, and her response kept coming up, well, everyone says I should write about this. So when I asked if she thought she should write about it, she just kept saying, well, it seems like something's missing. So sometimes students run the risk of making a chapter of their story the whole story. And to an extent, I do think that is the name of the game. They do have 650 words to present a quick snippet of themselves, but we want to help students pick the right snippet. So it's a snippet that they feel does best represent them, that they can feel proud of, not the one they feel they should be writing about. So ultimately, her final essay started out with the sentence, everyone says I should write about the blood clots. And then she wrote like one sentence of context, and she did end up doing the additional information section with additional context about what had happened to her. But then her essay turned and said something like, but if I just tell you about the blood clots, you're not going to know me. And her essay went in a completely different direction, and it was great. I loved it. And I still remember it years later. Also under authenticity, we sometimes get students who recognize that theirs is one of many essays being read, and they want to focus more on standing out than being themselves. I really want to make sure that a student does truly feel strongly about something, especially if they're putting themselves in the position of supporting a perspective or belief that might be potentially polarizing, and that they aren't just playing devil's advocate or going for shock value in order to catch the reader's attention. Lastly, to sort of pair maturity and authenticity together, I will occasionally get some pushback on the you can write about anything with a student who wants to come up with a random off-the-wall topic to challenge that. I think they just want to get me to say, no, you can't really write about that. And this can sometimes lead to an essay that I would call silly but no substance. And I'll still say, sure, if you can make a bigger connection. And usually that student will bob and flounder for a little bit before moving on to a different topic because they can't find enough insight and growth and character for their I love cheese essay. But I do bring that up because in our case studies later, Lindsey is going to share an example of a really off the wall and also food related topic that did work for a student. But moving on to growth, it is hard for me to say that any of these qualities are more important than the others. But I do think certain essays need to demonstrate growth in order to be successful. And mental health essays are a really good example of this. I think it's okay for students to write about their mental health experiences, provided they aren't smack in the middle of it as they're writing. And I think that is often an issue with an essay about mental health. Students are usually still in the middle of their experience and don't yet have the maturity, growth, and distance. And it doesn't give them the perspective to step back and reflect and give insight. We hear from colleges that one of the worst things a student can do for themselves in this type of essay is leave it open-ended and leave question marks and not show some sort of growth or insight. So it is important to really consider, has the student actually had time to grow? And do they have something to show for it? Can they show the college that they have grown and changed in some way? Another example might be when an essay ends with the decision to change, but they haven't actually made a change yet. And I sometimes see this with students who maybe haven't made the most of their academic potential in high school. They realize that and they're saying that college is going to be different. But spending a whole essay talking about a challenge or a setback and not being able to point to how the student has grown or what steps they've taken to try to grow is drawing attention to a problem without a solution and isn't necessarily going to instill a lot of confidence in the reader. I think that growth and insight relate pretty closely. So the insight, this is the reflection piece of the essay. This is the so what. And the main question here is the student actually doing some reflection in the first place? Are they giving insights or are they just trying to explain something that's happened? If that's the case, if they're just explaining and just giving context rather than reflecting, then it may be worth encouraging the additional information section instead. if the student is giving insights, then let's make sure that the insights are both authentic and original versus a cliche lessons learned. This is one where I think intentional brainstorming and feedback throughout the process can be really useful because teenagers and sometimes adults alike are not often actively reflecting on their experiences all the time as we're going through life. So open-ended questions can be helpful to get students reflecting a little bit deeper and thinking on their experiences in meaningful ways, instead of just giving the answers they think the grown-up reader wants to hear. Lastly, we have character. So are you learning enough about who the student is right now as they're writing, as opposed to who they were when they were going through what they're writing about, if they're writing about something that happened in the past? Are you learning enough about the student's character and core values from the essay? And do you learn more about the student and who the student is, or more about something that's happened to the student and their circumstances? And again, if it's the latter, it might be more of an explanation, like I mentioned in the insight section, that could be moved to that additional information section. All right, Lindsey is going to now walk us through the case studies, and I'm going to put a link to the Google Doc into the chat. So I've just added that to the chat. You should be able to see it. If you can't, yell at me. And Lindsey is going to walk us through.
Great. Thank you, Jamie. So as we approach these case studies, if you joined us before our opening, just a trigger warning, the first two case studies that we're about to share for you do concern sexual assault and child abuse. We want to be mindful of you, your health, your safety, your wellness. So please be aware that these first two topics are pretty intense. The next three case studies that we share are different and a little less intense in that way. Okay, so I'm going to take us through the case studies. We, of course, originally wanted to break out into breakout sessions. Can't you just see us all in one room together talking about these case studies? But instead, you'll have to listen to my voice as I read to you some of these essays. We're going to give you a brief overview of the case, talk about our concerns, wrap up with a conclusion, and then read aloud some excerpts from these students' essays. As Jamie mentioned again at the beginning, these are actual essays. We're not here to talk about the value of the writing or anything like that. We really just wanted to bring to you some topics that we wanted to discuss. So first, case study C. C is writing about sexual assault. Overview, she is a strong writer who is adamant about her common personal topic, sexual assault. C's parents did not support her through her trauma of assault and really swept it under the rug. And in working with her, I was concerned that perhaps writing about this topic was really a way for her to process her emotions, and maybe she would struggle producing an essay that was really magic. This was certainly a very impactful chapter in her life, but her activities and the rest of her application was so strong that I didn't want to overshadow it with this story. So those were some of the concerns. The conclusion was that I was confident that she could write about her trauma by focusing on how amazingly she has advocated for other victims. So let's read a little bit. I became a survivor of sexual violence before I even stepped foot in a high school class. Conditioned into silence, courtesy of a rape culture in which victims are blamed and persecuted, I shriveled away into a state of self-hatred and shame. My abuser was a white man, and more importantly, my older cousin. I dismissed his behavior and desperately tried to convince myself that it hadn't happened. It worked for a week or two until it happened again and again and again as the cycle continued, finally coming to an end upon adult intervention. He was never held accountable for what he did to me. No justice was ever served. And although the violence has stopped, I am still dealing with the impacts of it 3 years later. Additionally, C writes, I began to work as a member of the Women's March Youth Empower Committee. Selected to the role in 2018, I began to collaborate on national campaigns to advance the women's agenda. Connected with activists who shared my passion for equality, I gained the confidence to share my beliefs to incite change. Halfway through my term on the national committee, I co-founded Raleigh Youth Empower, which worked to identify and dismantle disenfranchising issues within our community. Upon finding the validation and strength to use my own voice, I strived to help others find theirs. C was admitted to all of the schools to which she applied, no doubt, right? She sounds amazing. Our next case study is A, writing about abuse. So our overview here, A is a really passionate student who throws herself into everything she does. In high school, she made straight A's in the toughest classes, was a leader on her school's speech and debate, youth and government, and track teams, volunteered for teen court, served on the teen board of more than one nonprofit, and worked after school to help her single mother pay the bills. A and her 4 younger siblings were abused by her father. Different concerns here than our first case, because in case C, there were other things that we wanted to focus on in her application. That story was, incredibly important to her, but we didn't want it to overshadow anything. With A, this really was important, and it provided the context needed for the rest of her application. So the concern was the main essay, her personal statement, the right place in the application for this information to come? Or should she center on an experience she's worked very hard to overcome in place of other parts of the story? So, how could that happen? Note, though, too, that she had excellent advocates in her school counselor and the teachers who would be writing her letters of recommendation. So our conclusion is that understanding A's experience of abuse gives the reader much needed context into the rest of her application. So the writer, A, created a hub and spoke system where her supplements complemented the main essay, and it made her whole story, her whole application so much fuller. So let's read a little bit of her essay. In the beginning, I went week on, week off between my mother and father, parenting my sisters at my father's house and then micromanaging my sisters at my mother's. My sisters, the Quads, were my immediate family. We didn't have a physical home. Sure, we had 2 houses, but neither parent actually fulfilled my desire for relaxation and peace. The Quads became my home, my comfort. I didn't think my love for my sisters was abnormally strong until a friend told me, I've never met anyone who loves their sisters as much as you do. But then again, most don't raise their sisters. It was my job to make sure they ate, completed their homework, and showered at my father's house because no one else would. I was an adult living in a child's body, yet no authority figure listened to me when I spoke on our home safety and home instability. My father would get drunk constantly, yell at us, ignore us when we needed him, and call us ungodly names. He never laid a hand on me. I was old enough to talk, but a 2-year-old is not. So additional paragraphs here. I'll never forget CPS, Child Protective Service worker after worker, coming into our school and our dad's house, talking to him, our counselors, or us, and never seeing, realizing, nor caring about the abuse occurring. Handprint after handprint and beer bottle after beer bottle, I was slowly giving up hope in the court system to save us. Because of my childhood, I decided that I would be the change in the court system. As a freakishly tall and mature elementary student, I worked to achieve the best grades, thinking that colleges cared about my straight A's in the 3rd grade. Even today, I know that I must push myself, whether it's implementing something similar to my freshman bill in youth and government, giving 13-year-olds the right to choose where they want to live between guardians, or even looking at CPS as a whole and figuring out where the lack of communication and care is coming from. Later in her essay, I'm lucky to have my mom who fought tooth and nail for the Quads and I, but sadly not all have a supportive guardian. My one goal in life is to help, to not let kids fall through the cracks of the system like my sisters and I. And if I can do that, then my life has been well used. So I'll do whatever's in my power to strengthen my skills and rise above the obstacles. So one day I can rest easy knowing the kids in the system are loved and cared for more than I was. A had a very ambitious college list, but she was admitted to nearly every school on her list, save for a few Ivies. Who cares? She was invited to interview for and received full merit scholarships at several highly selective colleges. We'd love your feedback as we continue through these case studies, so feel free to share in the chat. We're now going to transition from those 2 kind of intense stories and talk about some that are a little different. We alluded to this one previously. So case study number 3M is about writing off the wall topics. Okay, M struggled during the brainstorming process. Oh, it was such a struggle. He didn't feel like he had a life-changing story to share and like he couldn't get over that. So his involvement in marching band was one of his most significant activities and he wanted to write about it somehow. We talked about it a lot. And during one of our conversations about band, he told me a story about chicken nuggets. Remembering that story, he was then adamant about using it as his main essay. He would not shut up about chicken nuggets. And you know what? My concern was, okay, can he really write about chicken nuggets? And yeah, he definitely could have focused on his insight a bit more, that eye and magic, but his essay did reveal his voice and it was authentic. So let's read a little bit about his chicken nuggets. I recently took a break from chicken nuggets. I'm eating quarter pounders now. There are only so many chicken nuggets I can eat. I have my limits. In fact, 300 is my limit. I'm not a rich man. It takes a group effort to eat 300 chicken nuggets. My group consisted of students attending the North American Brass Band Association Championship. We were in Fort Wayne, Indiana. On the bus ride to a middle school for our last rehearsal before competing, the conversation turned to restaurants. I said, "Did you know you can get 100 chicken nuggets for $23? Let's get a group of people and go to McDonald's and get as many nuggets as we can." I eventually got 15 people in the nugget crew. Additionally, he writes, the cashier asked what sauces we wanted, and I told her we wanted all of them. So she handed me a bag that my crew mistook for the nuggets, but was really just filled to the brim with sauces. Unfortunately, the store didn't have anything bigger than the boxes of 10 that they sell nuggets in, so they had to make 30 boxes of 10 and only handed us about 120 in over 10 minutes. When we finally got all the food, we laid it on the biggest table with all the sauces and took pictures. After we ate, we took a group picture outside underneath the American flag. I still have the receipt to this day. In fact, it is even in a custom frame. Yeah, which he brought in and showed me, of course. So he was admitted to all the schools on his list. We'd love to hear your thoughts about that one. Case study number 4, T, writing about sexual identity. So again, as I shared before, my oldest is transgender, so I was not afraid of this topic and supported him. And T had been open about his sexuality since middle school. His high school experience has been mostly positive, though academically he did struggle. He wanted to write his essay about coming out to his parents and friends. So the concern, though, because we know that students are more comfortable writing about these essays, I have read several that have been great. Could he write an essay that didn't come across as cliched? He wasn't a particularly strong writer, but he was really confident and passionate about his story. And we concluded that his story was his own. His authenticity comes through regardless of the lack of sophistication. So let's read a little bit. Around the end of 5th grade, I knew something was different about me, but I couldn't exactly pinpoint what it was until I started to figure myself out and realized I didn't look at girls the same way that all my guy friends did. Then I started to realize around 6th grade that I had attraction towards guys. It was very scary to have to think about it at first because I didn't want to get bullied. I pushed that thought away and kept it in the back of my head. Fast forward to 7th grade, I watched videos on YouTube of other people coming out to figure out a way to say it when I came out to my parents. Finally, I had the courage to ask my parents to talk in their bedroom because I needed to tell them something. I hesitated out of fear and then started bawling as I let those 2 words out and said, "I'm gay." My parents said they knew. My mom cried with me because she knew it was hard for me to say. It was hard for me to say it. They both came to me with open arms and accepted me, which was a good first experience with coming out for me. Time flew by and I eventually told my brothers. First, I told my older brother and he started crying with me and said, "You got balls for doing that." It's a good thing to hear because I knew he accepted me after that and had respect for me. Additionally, I was the only gay person at the school and people thought I was faking it for attention. I dealt with homophobia and slurs thrown at me. That caused me to get into a dark place and I didn't like dealing with it because it hurt at first having to deal with people bullying me for my sexual orientation. Although I did have friends there who accepted me, which was a reassuring feeling. So being able to then come more out of my shell and express myself through visual art and dance was great for me. Now I'm very open about my sexuality and being able to talk about it with others, which doesn't bother me at all. Even if the questions might be harsh, I don't take offense to slurs anymore. I take it and brush it off and continue to laugh with them because they don't get the power that they want. He applied to schools that were a good fit academically and socially for him. And he was proud of his essay. I was too, and he had a positive experience as he transitioned to college. All right, our last case study is the one maybe you've been waiting for about politics. How could we have a conversation about controversial issues and not talk about politics? So our last one is a student who was a transfer student. So he came to us kind of midway through his process. We didn't really get a chance to really fully work through his essay. So what we're seeing is a draft. We're not really sure what he ended up with, but let's get an overview. Jay is applying as a transfer student. This past year, he took time off from school to work as an intern in a Republican congressman's Washington, D.C. office. His experiences have influenced his political views, and he wants to write about them in his essay. He is worried that sharing his ideology might be polarizing. He's afraid that admissions offices will be biased against him because he is revealing his conservative ideas. We talked it through and agreed that he should write about his ideas, but really focus on his own experiences and delete some of the political commentary. I'm not sure if that actually panned out though, so let's look at a first draft that he submitted. 4 years ago, Americans watched as an outsider worked his way to the forefront of the Republican Party. A media frenzy ensued, focusing on the style and personality of the president rather than the ideas within the party. His divisive actions, combined with his indecorous public relations, engendered a deep sense of disdain within the opposition. With the unrest at the Capitol on January 6th, Trump's critics have concluded that he is a malevolent dictator, and by extension, so are those that align with him ideologically. As a result, censorship of conservative voices has become commonplace across the internet and even within social circles. Witnessing the degradation of Central American principles, I felt compelled to get involved in government. After deciding to take a gap year due to the pandemic to pursue my career goals, I landed multiple work experiences with conservative lawmakers on Capitol Hill. The events on January 6th led peers to ridicule my career choices. My parents began to worry that my work experience would render me guilty by association to employers in the future. However, my passion for autonomy of the individual pushed me to ignore the criticism and concern. In the words of one of the most popular and accomplished Democrats in history, John F. Kennedy, ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country. President Kennedy's advice has resonated with me and encouraged me to get involved in the political sphere to the fullest extent in an effort to safeguard the principles that made this nation welcoming to all. We highlighted the parts that we really felt he could delete and use that space to instead talk more about his own personal experiences. We're not sure how that ended up. I do know, however, that he was admitted so far to 2 of the colleges that he applied to as a transfer student. So we shall see. Okay, we want to bring us back now to some of the tips and recommendations. We hope, though, that you'll continue to share your thoughts in the chat and the Q&A.
Okay. So we have broken this section down to reflect the writing process, starting with brainstorming. So I'm a big believer in doing a lot of brainstorming and brainstorming for the entire application process instead of just for the essay. That way, the student has a really good bird's eye view of their entire story and can plan out the entire application as a whole instead of restarting the brainstorming process for each new supplement or each new part of the application. This also helps us plan ahead and map out the best place to include certain stories. So if the student knows that they have a personal statement and the additional information section and the COVID question, and hopefully they even know some of their supplements when they get started, they can plan ahead and think, okay, what's going to go best where? And I like to be really intentional with my brainstorming activities. So if I know I want to see core values in an essay, which I want to see in all essays, I work that into brainstorming. So Ethan Sawyer has his values exercise, or just Google a list of core values to work through with students. A lot of them really haven't given a lot of thought to what their core values are before, so this might be new territory for them. Ethan also has about 1 million other brainstorming exercises if you aren't familiar with his work as the college essay guy, so I would recommend checking him out. He has a feelings and needs exercise that is not something that I use with all students, but he's got a pretty detailed video walkthrough where he uses it to help students who are writing what he calls a challenge essay, which can be helpful for dealing with difficult topics. So that would be a good thing to Google. My takeaway here is brainstorm big, brainstorm broadly. Sometimes students often want to stop the brainstorming process when they think they've hit on their essay topic, or they may even be resistant to brainstorming in the first place because they think they know what they're going to write about. But if we frame brainstorming as we're doing this for the whole process and getting the big picture, we get a lot more information to work with. And they have a lot more to work with, not only for their essay, but for other parts of the application as well.
The next is the first draft. As we mentioned, especially when dealing with some really intense topics, that first draft should really be a free write, right? So that cathartic free write will help students process. And you can put on your counseling hat and also guide students to process what they've written. So oftentimes I encourage students, don't worry about word count, obviously, just write down what your thoughts are, just get it out. And as we move from that first draft into later drafts, we often realize that later drafts don't look a thing like that first draft. But without that first draft, students, really have a difficult time processing what they're talking about. It's oftentimes the first time they've actually put their thoughts down in words and really articulated what it was that they were going through, what they were feeling, how this really affected them.
All right, so often when a student is writing about a tough topic, maybe for the first time, my biggest contribution to the actual editing process is to bring structure. These types of essays are usually not the time for students to get experimental with their writing structure. More often, they can benefit from following a pretty tight structure formula, and I like to give students examples of outlines they can follow. They're going to make it their own because it's their own story, their own details, so this can be really helpful to keep them focused and keep them on topic. So for counselors who are working with much larger groups of students or who can't be as involved in the drafting process, this might be helpful for your students in particular. And I've put a link to a handout in the chat that outlines all of these outlines. So here are 3 structure examples that I like to keep difficult topics focused and sort of on task. First is what I call linear with a moment of change. And you may have heard of a narrative structure or a journey structure. This is very similar, but I like to focus on that moment of change to make sure that the essay has a real shift and that we're focusing on change and growth. That's where the emphasis is. So the student begins by focusing on who they were before the change and growth occurred. What were the events leading up to it? Who were you before? Then talk about the catalyst itself and bring the reader into that moment with the student. Then we move into the time after the change, which is actually usually the present time when the student is writing. The moment of change has occurred. How are they different now? And this is a growth and insight section. Finally, if there's space, there may not be, but if there's space, where are they going next? How is what they've learned going to impact their next steps? And this really helps keep it from being that open-ended question mark essay we talked about earlier in the magic section. The second structure is giving students a word budget, and this is a little bit less rigid than that linear with a moment of change. Students can be a little looser here. Here, I essentially say, all right, spend no more than 1/3 of your essay on the challenge, the background, the story, and then the rest needs to be growth and insights. Usually in those first few drafts, that order is reversed. So students will focus almost entirely on their story, on what's happened, and you can sometimes get an overwhelmingly sad essay that has a little glimmer of hope in the last sentence. And this model intentionally flips that so that we are focusing predominantly, again, on growth and change. I have found that students can need a lot of help knowing which details to cut with this one. Lindsey mentioned the counseling hat a minute ago, and so this is keep the counseling hat on, but also break out the red pen. Students have lived their stories and can get really attached to details that are important to them. And so they may not know which details can be cut because they're not necessary to the essay, to the story that they're telling. So there's a balance here between empathy and editing. So really making sure that in the second part of the essay, the insights are clear, the character and the core values are clear. And so if there are details in the first part of the story that are not pointing to the growth in the insight section and the character and the core values, that's the low-hanging fruit for the sake of the essay. Important to the student's individual story, less important for the piece of writing that they're trying to create. I like both of these structures because they do focus on change and insight and growth. And I think it can be a good indicator if a student doesn't have enough material to fill these reflection sections, that they either need to go back and do some more brainstorming and reflect a little bit more, or they may not yet have enough growth and insight, and this may not be the best topic for them to choose for their personal statement. Lastly, we have value vignettes, and this would be the loosest and most creative structure. This is great for a student who wants to talk about a certain topic, but maybe doesn't want to delve into it for 650 words. Or maybe they have insights, but their insights aren't all that deep. Or they have a lot they just want to talk about. So here is where I would help a student figure out, all right, what is the insight you're trying to make? What is the core value that your tough topic is pointing to? And make it a section of an essay along with other vignettes. So maybe during a brainstorming session, the student with polarizing political beliefs identify some other times in their life when they have gone against the grain or held their own opinion in less polarizing ways. And so each of these gets a vignette. And so instead of an entire essay about, here's my one polarizing belief that might put me at odds with my reader, the student writes an essay that's more, I'm someone who's comfortable with my beliefs, even when they're not popular, and hear how that has popped up in my life over time. You're also learning a lot more about the student that way. This is also a great way, like I mentioned in the first part of the presentation, to keep the chapter of a student's story from overtaking the whole story. So those are 3 structures that might be able to help students. And now Lindsey is going to walk us through some finishing touches.
And I know that we are at our time limit, so be mindful of your time. Just quickly, finishing touches, just make sure that you are relying on other readers. Reach out to your colleagues for perspective if you know the story too well, as I needed to do. Remind yourself to keep your own biases in check. So think about what you wrote down for your no never and be mindful of that. Okay, if you want to hang with us and we have the availability, we would love to hear some of your thoughts in the chat if anyone has anything else that they want anything to share. We again appreciate your time. Thank you so much for attending our session today. Maybe we'll be able to meet in person so soon. We shall see, but thank you everyone for joining us today. We really appreciate it.
And I've just re-linked the case studies and the handout in the chat, so they are there if you missed those.
So thanks everybody. Have a great session. Yeah, so we do have a comment about the chicken nugget story. Yeah, that was our biggest concern with the chicken nuggets, was that he definitely needed to draw some deeper insights. And luckily he had some supplements that were able to help him with that. But I think in that essay, he could have gone a little bit deeper. He did have a paragraph on insightful information about what it meant to him to be in marching band and what that felt like to be a part of a group. So that was it, but he definitely could have gone deeper into that. So what and the insights. Yeah, we didn't share that part.
And I will say, I think the chicken nugget story resonated with some people, because earlier in the chat, we had a comment about someone who loved the chicken nugget story. Having read millions of essays over the years, too many in a row can really bring down your day. Something lighthearted really brightens the day. So different.
Yeah. Exactly. Well, I think we're out of time. So thanks everybody for being with us. Feel free to reach out if there's anything that we can help with. But thank you all.
Hey, Jamie and Lindsay, Tracy, well done.
Thank you.
Yeah, well, very interesting. Did you see the number of your participants?
Yeah, yay, so fun.
Yeah, you were way up there, 154, I think I saw.
Great.
All right, you guys.
So much for guiding us through this.
Absolutely, very interesting. I enjoyed it on my end.
Thank you.
All right, you guys, I can end the meeting for you.
Okay, sounds great. Thanks so much.
Bye-bye.